And just in case I do that, why don't I say again that I'm Robert Wright and you're Andrew Sullivan. We're talking about your book, The Conservative Soul. Now, you know, in the political realm, the fundamentalism you complain about that has beset the Republican Party, for example, not only that, but that's what you're focusing on, it has this, as I said, it has this feature of a kind of Manichaean worldview and a kind of lack of self-doubt or intellectual humility. Now, in the book, you profess, I think commendably, to have suffered from those things yourself to some extent, not only in a religious realm. For example, in talking about the Iraq War, in the run-up to the Iraq War, you say you're kind of horrified to look back and see how certain you felt in your support of the war. Now,
and especially since at the time I was quite strongly critical of your early attempts to say, hold on, guys, let's not get carried away here. Let's realize that multilateralism still matters.
Yes, I vividly remember some of your skepticism about my early attempt. At one point, you used the dreaded word
appeasement.
Appeasement. I'm glad you remember calling me an appeaser, Andrew.
I do, and
the funny thing is, I think if you go back and look at the column you were talking about, that is a Slate column shortly after 9/11. I swear, I haven't gone back and checked, but I think if you go back and read the column, what I was saying, it was in the context of, that was in the context of the coming Afghanistan war, and I was saying, look, you know, if they won't cough the guy up, meaning if they won't give us bin Laden, okay, it may be war, but let's do it, you know, as multilaterally as possible, go through the international institutions, blah, blah, blah. I think it was really quite different from a sheerly, you know, kind of pacifist document. But such was the tenor of the times that people like me were on the far left.
Yes. And look, the only thing I can say is that your position is held up much better than mine. And that part of what prompted this book was my own, to some extent, shame and disappointment in my own analytical errors and also in my own passionate certainty. And I think, frankly, in trying to understand that, I think that emotion played a huge part in it. I mean, I think that my own and many other people's trauma at what happened on 9/11 prompted emotional state of mind that enabled us not to think as clearly as we might have done at the time. And I am pretty candid in the book about saying I regret that, and I've learned from that, and it helped me to also rethink conservatism from first principles. I mean, that is one of the occasions for writing this book, that I recognized in my own conservative past some fundamental errors that have been empirically, I think without any doubt, proven wrong. And it behooves me to take account of that. I don't think my motives, frankly, were wrong. I think I meant well. I think I still believe that the kind of forces we were confronting are terribly dangerous and need to be confronted.
Oh, I agree on that.
And I know you do. And I think also you and I are not that far apart in understanding the practical difficulties of the United Nations as an institution in actually getting anything seriously done.
Oh yeah, no, it's structurally flawed and has to be revamped big time.
I think we could agree on that. And actually in Afghanistan, I think we might have not been that far apart at all in practice. It was done more multilaterally than possible. It was Iraq that really was the critical, a much harder case. And I picked the wrong, I was misled or misled myself or was not skeptical enough. I'm not blaming others, although they bear some of the blame. I didn't have my own CIA. I did really truly believe in weapons of mass destruction, stockpiles of them in Iraq.
Yeah, well, let me say on that, although the last 5 minutes of mea culpa has been about as disarming a mea culpa as I've ever heard, I am nonetheless going to challenge you on the weapons of mass destruction point, just to the following extent. In your book, you say, in The Conservative Soul, you say, liberals and conservatives alike thought he had the weapons. Now, that's and so we were all wrong. That is true. That is literally true. I thought he had the weapons. Everybody did. But as you may recall, the UN inspectors were in there. They were by the eve of the war being allowed to go into any building they wanted to go into. And my argument, although I was sure that if they kept it up long enough, they would find weapons of mass destruction. My argument was, hey, let's just bolster this force. At that point, Bush could have gotten that kind of deal. If he had said, look, I'll hold off on the war if we'll triple the force and leave it in there for 2 years, whatever. Let's see what they find. And that's the criticism I have of people who say that the weapons of mass destruction issue was the heart of their support of the war, although I'm not sure you would say that. That was by no means the only part of
the heart of my position. It was part of my position.
Right.
I had a complicated position, like a lot of people did. I was concerned at that point, looking back, that that we didn't. I mean, that I was persuaded this was a matter of great urgency, and then I think what happened in that spring, or the end of that winter, early of that spring, was that there was a certain kind of logic of mobilization of forces in the Gulf that made it hard for us to continue that pressure indefinitely. We would have had to, at some point, recycle the troops and remove the pressure. And I think when we look back, we should have waited longer. But also, Bob, I mean, obviously, I miscalculated what the Bush administration was planning to do. I genuinely think, and I've gone back and looked at this just to make sure, because, we're all capable of looking back at our own records and sort of remembering it in a slightly beneficial way to ourselves. I really did believe they would send in vast forces and install and create order, and I also believed that, as I'm sure you did, that Saddam was obviously a monster and a danger. And I also believed that the regime itself was not stable, that it was going to go sometime or other, and that at some point we would probably have to go in there. However, we did it in the wrong circumstances, followed by really quite staggering ineptitude that is still, I think, baffling to me.
Well, the other thing, I mean, as long as we're trashing Bush, on the weapons of mass destruction front, is I've since heard an interview with Hans Blix suggesting that Bush knew something we didn't know, which is that the buildings the inspectors were looking in, had been supplied, it was following a list, 1 through 30 or something, of all the places that U.S. intelligence said the weapons of mass destruction were. So by the time Bush launched the war, he knew that his own intelligence was fundamentally unreliable, okay?
If that's true...
Go ahead. You finish the sentence.
If that's true, I should be even angrier than you.
Well, listen, if that's true, I'm not a constitutional scholar, but if it's true, and this is what Hans Blix said in this interview, and if my interpretation of it is correct, it wouldn't, I wouldn't blame somebody for letting the word impeachment cross their lips. I mean, that is really close to criminal, certainly in a moral sense, if I'm getting this right, which is that we knew that at that point that our intelligence was just totally unreliable because he had looked at gone right down the list and found that the weapons were not at the exact places we were pretty sure they were.
For me, as another piece of evidence that I've never been quite to grapple with was looking at the war plan that they had. If the threat was as grave from those weapons as we understood, why were those weapon sites not part of the invasion plan? Because presumably they could have been used against us. That, to me, is more strong evidence that they didn't really believe they existed, or at least they took only minimal precautions about them. So, look, and I think if a president directly lies to the people on the question of going to war, it is impeachable. I mean, it's about as bad as it gets. It's a violation of the most profound public trust, I think. Now, look, at the same time, I'm not using that to exculpate myself. All I can say is that I did pretty quickly realize I was up a gum tree and had made miscalculations, and pretty quickly started asking some tough questions. And the more I looked into what was going on, the more disenchanted I became, and endorsed someone I can't stand, John Kerry, for president in 2004, because of these issues. But also because as a small government conservative, I just do not have anything in common with the current Rove Bush strategy. I found it not just distasteful, but inimical to the kind of politics I support. Now, it may actually, paradoxically, be less, I think, objectively inimical to some liberals, because they're more comfortable with a slightly bigger government than I am. I mean, for example, Bill Clinton never passed a Medicare prescription bill. Now, we can argue about whether that was a good bill, but it was done, and it's a hugely expensive program, and it may get more expensive with a new Congress. But he did it, and I wouldn't have voted for it.
Yeah. Well, Kerry was a tough one for me to swallow too, I've got to say. But I
you
swallowed.
did your duty.
I voted for him. And
by the way, what's fascinating now, I mean, that Rumsfeld memo was virtually Kerry's memo. And the conclusion now in Washington that we needed to increase general troop sizes in the Army as a whole, which Al Gore ran on in 2000 and Kerry ran on in 2004, is now the consensus.
Yeah.
That these Democratic, allegedly lily-livered peaceniks were more pro-military than this current administration for the last 2 election cycles.
Yeah, I mean, see, Rumsfeld correctly perceived that the technology we have allows us to win wars in the strict sense of, conquering, seizing cities and stuff with a lean force. That part is true.
Yeah.
What I think he didn't see is that some of the same technologies that allow us to do that, these information technologies, actually empower insurrections. And so, if anything, mean that once you've won the war, you're going to need maybe a bigger force than ever. And the other thing is just that...
by the way, I mean, one of the things I learned recently, there was a very similar debate in the 1920s with Britain in Iraq. And the military in Britain actually wanted a very light invasion occupation force. Churchill overruled them. And there are arguments, there's been a slight debate about how many forces that were in Iraq in the 20s. But my friend Neil Ferguson did an analysis for me, actually, and said that the soldier per capita ratio in Iraq in the 1920s for British occupying was something close to 20 times the soldier per capita ratio that we now have in Iraq. In other words, the British, with their vast imperial experience, believed that Iraq, of all places, because it was, as Churchill put it, an ungrateful volcano, required very labor-intensive occupation.
Well, yeah, and the occupations during the Clinton administration, like in the former Yugoslavia, had a much higher ratio of soldiers to civilians, and apparently this was one thing the Bush administration didn't like about those ratios, was just that it was Clintonian. I mean, it was one of the things they dismissed about their predecessor was that he had gotten that right. I think that came up explicitly in the early discussions. Oh, we can do it cheaper than they did it.
The Federalist Papers are so smart about faction and the dangers of faction in American politics that I think in some ways someone should resurrect Federalist 11, where we really do understand that the national interest is sacrificed to pure petty factionalism. I mean, it's idiotic for a government to say we're doing this simply because the previous administration did the opposite. I mean, it's just irrational, beyond idiotic government. Let me check. We're still doing fine.
Digits still flying by?
Yes.
You got a few more minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me.
Which is the thing? I have little ears. I'm afraid. So this thing keeps popping out, but
that's okay. You want to switch ears or anything?
No, they're both the same size.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that God did that to you.
It's all right. I don't think he took that close an interest.
Oh, I don't know. I think you're special, Andrew.
My mother does, anyway.
Yeah. Mine felt the same way. Not about you, I mean. About me.
Excuse me.
Are we okay at that end?
Yeah, I'm fine.
Okay. Let me try to put you on the defensive again. You, as I said, commendably admit that kind of elements of a fundamentalist attitude have entered your political worldview occasionally in the past. Let me suggests that some of the vestiges may still reside there. One of the features, as we said, is a tendency to divide the world into two opposing kind of monolithic entities, the good and the bad. And you do continue to buy into this concept of Islamofascism, right? And there are those of us who would argue that gives more unity. I mean, to view radical Muslims everywhere as being fundamentally part of the same movement may mislead us. Now, at the same time, I have to concede that this can change over time, and they can acquire. I think they have acquired more unity. The different, the perhaps formerly more diverse radical Islamic movements around the world. But I also think that one thing that can give them more unity is if we treat them as unified and treat every emergence of an Islamic radical threat as being part of the larger whole and something that has to be confronted in exactly those terms. This would be my argument, which you would not buy into, I'm sure.
No, I don't think it's. I think part of the structure of the book is designed to tell a story, really, about the dangers of the fusion of fundamentalist religion with political power. And therefore, inevitably, it's not a book that details the complexities and rivalries and deep divides within, for example, Christianity. I mean, we could talk about the wars, the fundamentalist wars of the 16th, 17th centuries were not of Christians against infidels; they were of Christians against Christians. But the impulse was the same. And certainly Al-Qaeda, as in its original and in its most potent form, was obviously a Sunni Wahhabist strain of Islam that does not represent all of Islam. In fact, I think your insight is there can be many different Islamisms. And I think what we're about, my own view, I may be wrong about this, but my own suspicion is that those splits that are what we call these people isn't going to affect them at all. That in fact their own internal divisions will exist and will endure regardless of our description of them. I was just trying to make an important point about the conflation of politics and fundamentalism that I find dangerous. But as we're finding, I think, and it may be paradoxically an advantage for the West, that the energies of religious hatred are beginning to turn inward in Islam and not so much outward. In other words, that when we get the regional war in Iraq that we seem unable to prevent, you will see that most of the terrorism, as we know, most of Al-Qaeda's terrorism has now been directed at Muslims. I mean, I think empirically speaking, there's no question.
Yeah.
There are many more victims, many more Shiite victims of Sunni violence than Christian victims or Western victims.
Although I'm not sure that was kind of, that came from the top of Al-Qaeda. I mean, it happened in a funny way, which is that first of all, Zarqawi affiliated with the larger Al-Qaeda, right, and had not historically been closely allied with the larger Al-Qaeda. He, in Iraq, adopted the tactic of fomenting sectarian war, and it's not clear to me that bin Laden and the larger Al-Qaeda really initially liked that or signed on to it. It had not been...
I think they wanted, because they smartly understood that if they wanted the paradigm to be Islam against the West, and that they would be the spearhead of this. But Zarqawi screwed it up in a way.
Right, exactly.
And actually we know that Zawahiri and bin Laden got a little alarmed by Zarqawi and tried to rein him in at one point.
Right.
But Zarqawi was smarter in a way. He realized that these tensions are deeper and more violent. Just as in some ways, I mean, when people ask me why I don't become an Episcopalian because of my rather liberal theology within Benedict's church, and I'm like, well, look, I really would rather be a Muslim than an Episcopalian. I mean, the narcissism of small differences, it matters psychologically. And the truth is that Sunnis hate Shiites much more than they hate Christians. Now, they may both hate the Jews more, but it may even be in the Israelis' interest to direct Arab-Muslim violence against each other rather than against either the Jews or the West. And
Well,
that may be a dynamic that helps us.
That's arguable. I don't know. I mean,
it's a very dangerous path to go down.
It's a dangerous experiment. I mean, I would say it's certainly in Israel's interest to reduce the amount of anti-Israeli, Israeli-directed hatred. But see, this gets back to what to me is the danger of viewing the threat as fundamentally unified. I think from Israel's point of view, and I understand this totally, it's the way I would feel if I was an Israeli. You look at Hezbollah, you look at Hamas, and it just seems like Hezbollah/Hamas, right? I mean, neither one of them likes you. They both seem to want to do you violence and so on. But if you ask yourself what is generating the turmoil and the hatred, well, part of it, I mean, look, part of it is Israel, no doubt. But there are other dimensions of this. And Hezbollah, for example, in Lebanon, Shiites are systematically underrepresented within the Lebanese political system. I mean, structurally, this was built in so that the Shiites would not govern, even though they are majority. And it's still built into the government. And that's like half of what's driving them crazy. And
it's half of what drove them crazy in Iraq. And what is driving them crazy in Iraq?
Well, right. It's domestic issues, and it's important to see those things clearly.
Yeah.
And not to assume that all of the hatred originates in resistance to Israel, if some of it has a separate kind of origin that might be treated independently, you know?
Yes, and I think actually part of the neoconservative critique is precisely that the violence in the Middle East cannot be understood solely in terms of the Israeli question. I mean, for example, the current battle between Hamas and Fatah, there are two civil wars. There's one in Iraq and there's one in the Palestinian territories right now.
Right. Well, but that's a good example. You were saying it might be good for Israel to even, as I understood you, foment a certain amount of intra-Muslim tension. I personally think this would be a good counterexample. I am deeply concerned about what's going to happen if Hamas and Fatah really square off in a true civil war, which now looks like it may happen. I mean, my view is that the kind of survival of Israel, certainly the healthy survival of Israel, the salvation of Israel in a certain sense of the word, depends on ultimately solving the Palestinian problem. And you can't solve it if there is no coherence on the Palestinian side. Now, granted, it has not. Coherence on the Palestinian side has certainly not spontaneously emerged, and I can understand impatience with that. But it seems to me if the Palestinians just dissolve in turmoil, that just means the problem is not going to get solved, like in our lifetimes, maybe.
No, but it may be, and this is the imponderable. It may be that for any such unity to emerge, these pathologies and these divisions have to be resolved, and sometimes warfare is the only way to resolve them. I mean, if you look at the 30 Years' War in Europe, you saw an appalling bloodshed in Germany and around Europe for about 30 years over religious sectarian differences. It was only experiencing the nightmare of that made them finally convinced that it wasn't worth it. Until you've actually faced your own country dissolving into civil war, you don't really psychologically profoundly understand why the West moved into modernity. Because, Hobbes would never have written what he wrote had he not experienced a civil war in which people murdered each other over religion. Montaigne would never have written his brilliant essays without observing people burning at the stake. Sometimes human experience requires actually witnessing the consequences of these kind of sectarian loyalties before they can be overcome. And that may be, I'm not arguing for fomenting it. I'm arguing simply that it may be folly to try and prevent it. It's part of a historical process that has to occur in order for there to be eventual interlocutors for us to deal with, who are able to dialogue with us on rational grounds on the basis of unified interests. Whereas now you can make an agreement with people and the next minute someone else is fighting them and they've decided they don't hold those agreements. They don't represent any unified population, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose it's conceivable it could work out well, and I would say, whether or not, I mean, even if you don't advocate intentionally fomenting it, my own view, and this is an argument we shouldn't get into probably, my own view is that some American and Israeli policies have, as a matter of fact, fomented this kind of strife on the Palestinian side.
In Iraq, obviously we did our best not to foment it.
Oh, yeah, no, we did, and our enemies wisely saw that this would be the final blow of our quest for order in Iraq if they fomented it.
What's amazing to me in Iraq is that the two critical people who have clearly instigated this, Zarqawi and Sadr. Zarqawi with I think the Samarra mosque bombing probably was the moment that the war finally was lost. And Sadr, but both Sadr and Zarqawi could have been taken out years ago.
Well, it's very funny. I mean, the first thing I say about Sadr is nominally, actually, he purports to not be sectarian. He purports to be an Iraqi nationalist who has, at certain key moments, ostensibly favored a kind of pan-Iraqi direction, and partly because there are tensions among the Shiites. But, it's funny, very early on, when I first read about this guy, Muqtada al-Sadr, I mean way early on, a few months after we took Baghdad, I said to a friend of mine, maybe we should just kill this guy.
Oh, I think we should have done early, and we could have killed Zarqawi before the war started, as you know, and we had an absolute beat on him. I actually asked Paul Wolfowitz directly about that over dinner one night. Why didn't we do it? And he said we were scared that it would disrupt the diplomatic negotiation. It would make it look as if we wanted to go to war in Iraq anyway, and would have ruined the diplomacy at the time.
Of course, the big story here is that you've been having dinner with Paul Wolfowitz.
This is a while back, actually, but
this leads to something I wanted to ask you about. In your book, you kind of make a point of getting Leo Strauss off the hook. We should say, by way of background, Strauss is this. He taught at the University of Chicago. He's purported to be the intellectual godfather of a number of neoconservatives. And there are various things attributed to him, some of which fit into kind of conspiracy theories very well, according to which, he orchestrated what ultimately became the neocon conspiracy. But here's the hook you get him off. I mean, you say you look into Strauss's work pretty heavily and find that he's not guilty of some of the things he's charged of. One of the things he's charged, this is the quote from your book. And so it may be useful, some of his followers argued, to publicly support those who retain core elements of unquestioned biblical faith in order to have some people who could defend a country and a civilization vulnerable to barbarians. And I gather it's your conclusion that was not, whether or not his followers argued that was not pure Strauss. You don't find that kind of strand, right?
I think there's some element of that in his concern about the West's solidity against the Soviet Union and about totalitarianism, which stems from his own experience in escaping Nazi Germany. But I don't see in Strauss these sort of arch ideas of attempting to con the American public, to foist an elite position on. I don't see that. I think when we bumped into each other at Starbucks when I was writing this book, I was sitting there reading Strauss. I really did want to make sure I'd read The Horse's Mouth before I wrote about it. I found in Strauss a very curious, skeptical, I might add, atheist philosopher.
Well, yeah, the Straussian project is atheist and yet wants to find a firm grounding for, kind of absolute moral direction, right?
Yeah, there are many. The other thing to say about Straussians is that there are many different factions, and it gets quite esoteric at times, not to use a Straussian term.
Yeah, but
I'm not convinced, Bob, that there's some sort of Straussian conspiracy. I'm not convinced that his work, or rather, I would say the following: that I think it's possible for people to have abused the writings of Strauss for their own purposes.
Right.
I think that Strauss himself is a much more serious and interesting writer than that would suggest. Now, Just as, for example, Freud, I think, when you go back and read the actual Freud, if you read, theories of sexuality, if you read the notion of the Freudians of the 50s and 60s, the arguments they were making, utterly alien to Freud's humanistic, open-minded, empirical, and querulous spirit. So I let Strauss off the hook. I don't necessarily let some Straussians off the hook.
Yeah, but I was wondering why you didn't, stick them a little more directly on the hook. I mean, I don't buy the conspiracy theories either, but there's a kind of much less conspiratorial version of this kind of cynicism that I thought you were on the verge of alleging, just because it has been alleged. And you got into kind of Bill Kristol and the Weekly Standard and their support for the religious right and their position on abortion and stem cells and so on. And I mean, as you know, it's been kind of alleged that basically they're cutting a deal with the religious right.
Yeah.
That it isn't that they feel so strongly about that, but they feel if they support the religious right on those issues, the religious right will support their foreign policy.
Yeah.
And you did not quite come out and say that. I was turning the page, waiting. And so here's your chance, Andrew. Make the allegation.
I think if you read the central chapter on the Bush Crucible, I think you can read between the lines and see that. And I do think it's being exposed. But I really didn't want to write a book that was like that. I mean, I didn't want to write a book. I mean, they wanted me to call it the hijacking of conservatism, or these other more I thought I should just lay out where I think they're wrong and assume that they're all well-intentioned, because I think the arguments collapse even if they're well-intentioned. So I didn't need to argue that they're a bunch of cynics and charlatans, even though I think some of them are.
Okay.
I mean, I don't even know whether Bill Kristol believes in God. I just think he believes in religion. But again, do I really want to go into that with these people? Do I really want to go there? I think I decided to write. On the blog on a daily basis, I take shots at people. It was a much more sort of sharp elbow kind of dialogue. The book, I really tried to make an effort to be a completely constructive and fair-minded argument.
Well, your book voice is different from your blog voice, and people who only know your blog voice should read it, because it is different, and it's nice. It's more maybe reflective and a little more sedate, which is not to say it has sedative properties, but a little more, a little calmer.
I do think the different media require different kind of voices. I think that when you're, I'm a debater. I grew up debating. That's how I was trained to debate, and mixing it up and sometimes saying provocative things to get interesting debates going, I think is perfectly legitimate discourse. I have nothing to apologize on that front. And, bashing Ramesh Panura on a daily basis, or even teasing Mickey or whatever, I consider that just to be part of the fun of debate. But when you're writing a book that's really about your beliefs and core beliefs, I think you owe it to your readers, really, to just try and leave all that aside and to write what I hope is a constructive argument. I think in my 3 books that I've written, including Virtue Normal and Love Undetectable, I've really, really tried hard to write in a very reasonable voice that anybody, even my opponents, can respect. Even though it turns out that in reviewing it, they have not. But what can you do?
Isn't it frustrating how often it happens that it's manifestly the case that a reviewer has not read your book?
Yes, and it's also, for example, there was a recent book review of it in the Chronicle of Higher Education, which regarded it as an example of what happens when conservatives don't have access to the academy. And my book was not seriously dealing with intellectual or academic history. Well, I don't know how many popular books, I say popular, books that are put out there for the general public have long discussions of Leo Strauss and Michael Oakeshott. I don't know what else I'm supposed to do.
You threw in Montaigne, too, man.
And a lot of Montaigne, who's not exactly the most accessible or popular writer. But I was interested, putting Montaigne into the middle of conservatism is really an Oakeshottian move, actually. But But because I wanted to talk about and also celebrate, see, the one thing I wanted to do this book to do was to celebrate the Western achievement, which is precisely by disabling religion from its public role, we have also enabled this incredible flourishing of personality and individualism and free thought and inventiveness and innovation that you do not see in religious fundamentalist societies. There is a reason why the West has been so immensely successful. It's because it has trusted the human individual to remake his or her own life as he or she sees fit. And that's my libertarian sort of wing coming in there. And I also believe that the faith itself is not threatened by liberty. And I think that's sort of the great American gamble, which is why when I see that gamble being denied, which is what it is by Santorum or George or Crystal or all these people, I think they've missed the genius of America. This is in some ways, I think, a pretty patriotic book, especially in its final chapters, where I sort of celebrate what I love about America.
You do, but there's a kind of irony, it seems to me. I mean, one thing you say America should be fundamentally about is the pursuit of happiness.
Yeah.
And yet, there's a little bit of a melancholy streak in this book. I mean, am I reading that into it? Or, I mean, partly because you're saying a true conservative reckons with the inevitability of loss.
And death.
Yeah.
And failure.
And you say, in fact, you say at one point, every substantive human endeavor ends ultimately in failure. And I assume when you wrote that, you meant to exempt Blogging Heads TV. But
no, Bob, you and I are both going to die, and our arguments, some of them will fade.
But Blogging Heads TV will live on.
It'll live on in somewhere or other. Just as there'll be somebody in a few hundred years' time that may come across the cache of my blog and find it an amusing. But we'll die. We will lose. I have less hair. I embrace the tragedy of human existence.
Well, you do. I mean, that's. But you see what I mean about that kind of this kind of dimension of the book. It's. I mean, it struck me as a little ironic that. In other words, it does not have what you sometimes see in libertarians, which is really a kind of Panglossian, naivete.
And I think that's why I don't think of myself as a libertarian or easily fit in with it, because there is a sort of, the world is inevitably improving, that liberty solves all problems, that, no. The human predicament is inherently, because of death, a failure. And also, as I pointed with Oakeshott, even practical life, even achievement, upon achieving it, even if you succeed, it's over. Then there's something else has to be done.
Yeah.
So there's no resting point. There's no moment at which you could say, I'm done. That's why we just interrupt our lives with Christmases and birthdays and feasts and holidays, because it's the only moment we can actually allow ourselves to be happy. The rest of our life is, as Hobbes put it, pursuit of one essentially doomed enterprise after another. But the question, the religious aspect of it is reconciling oneself with that and enjoying it. See, I think there's fun to be had. That once you've gotten past the tragedy, you can enjoy the moment.
Although it's a hell of a lot easier if you think you're going to heaven, Andrew. That's an advantage.
I don't necessarily think that. I mean, I think the notion of surety, the Christians being sure they're heaven-bound, is itself a blasphemy. We don't know what God is going to do with us. We just don't know.
You mean you don't know whether there is a heaven, or you don't know whether you merit it?
I don't know whether I merit it. I don't know whether you merit it, Bob. I don't know whether you're going to go there before I do.
Andrew, that hurt. Yeah, well.
We're in no position to judge, okay, in this particular case.
Okay. Maybe two quick final challenges to your worldview. Well, one is just, very much along this vein, you were very disdainful of what you know is one of my favorite themes, that history has some kind of direction. And even leaving aside whether it's good, it's a direction. I think you can argue it's more good than bad, but it seems to be heading somewhere. In the obvious sense is that the complexity and scope of social organization has tended to grow and so on. And there are certain benign aspects of recent history, I think, which you explicitly dismiss in the book, one of which is that, well, I would put it in a moderate form. You dismiss the extreme form of it, that trade among nations will bring an end to war. I would certainly defend the moderate version of it, which is that economic entanglement among nations under most circumstances tends to reduce the chances of war, and that the great hope of stabilizing the world probably lies in that fact, even though there are other problems sprouting up as fast as you can stomp them down, But you're not buying into any of that source of cheer, are you?
Not really. At some level, I am. I mean, look, I'm alive because of the advance of modern medicine. I'm not a Luddite in that sense. But at a deepest level, I'm not sure that. I think these questions emerge eternally. I mean, the emergence of fundamentalist religious violence in the 21st century was not something the founders of America really anticipated. And I would think that your understanding of the ingrained nature of human nature from evolution would suspect that our capacity to change our fundamental behaviors is very limited from generation to generation. It may be happening glacially. And gradually, in a way that I think is a little hard to measure, and I certainly wouldn't, I don't think, doubt it. From the point of view of our horizon, our time horizon, we have to expect that human beings are going to be basically as screwed up today as they were in the Stone Age, not that much more.
Well, I think
here's my main fundamental issue, which I think you agree with. I don't know. I think that human beings may have intellectually advanced to an extraordinarily high level, but that their genes have not.
Yeah, no, that's the problem. I would say certainly, genetically we haven't come far since the Stone Age, and yet we are put by history in positions where if we do not overcome the more unfortunate legacies of evolution, such as, one thing that's central to your book, the tendency to dichotomize between in-group and out-group and attribute evil to the out-group if you perceive their interests as clashing with yours, and then deal with them in a, kind of appropriately simplistic fashion given those assumptions, and just raw hatred and all the rest. I mean, history puts us in situations, and I think increasingly puts us in situations, where if we do not overcome some of these tendencies, we're all in deep trouble. And
yes, but my point is simply, I totally agree with your analysis, but I will tell you this, we will not overcome them.
Andrew, how can a person with a rich spiritual life give up on what is fundamentally a spiritual challenge? And this is...
I may try myself. I may hope others will, but I know from my own experience how tough that is. You know from your own experience.
Yeah, but at the same time, look at how far we've come. I mean, just the idea that here we would all, all the people you and I hang out with, Andrew, would say and believe that people everywhere, regardless of race and religion, deserve to be accorded the same fundamental human rights, okay? Now, 5,000 years ago, I don't think anybody was saying that.
I know. And it's not a question of what we taught ourselves to believe, the advances we've made in what we understand. The question is whether our more base instincts just simply overwhelm them at certain times. Like, for example, in retrospect, I think rationally, I understand that my response to 9/11 was not the optimal response. You were better.
Doesn't that give you hope?
No, because I'm much more typical than you.
That potentially all humans could be like me, Andrew?
It's a dream that, I'm afraid I'm unable to summon the optimism to grapple with.
Well,
the basic reality is that we are living through genocide again. We're living through fundamentalist religious warfare again. We're living through ethnic cleansing and genocide. We are living through famine. We are living through unspeakable cruelty on mass scale. All over human history is not. I mean, I know intellectually we've made huge strides. Thank God, huge strides. Thank God for Immanuel Kant. Thank God for John Locke. Thank God for Madison. Thank God for Jefferson. These things matter. But the United States what is torturing people. Okay, I mean, it's not as if an Enlightenment country can't revert.
No, it's not.
It's not as if Weimar Germany did not understand all the things you're saying. And I put it this way: I'd love to believe, and I think you may be right, glacially, over the next maybe 35 to 40 millennia. But the odds of our getting to that without catastrophe are, I would say, zero. Zero.
Well, I would say if we don't advance kind of morally / spiritually, in terms of, for example, expanding our capacity to understand what it's like to be someone in a radically different circumstance from our own, I would say we're in epic trouble.
We are.
Yeah. Well, you know, I really.
So now you're being the squish head, and I'm being the realist.
I'm not being the squish head because I don't think it's going to be easy. The squish head thinks all you've got to do, is go get in touch with people and you'll like each other. I don't believe that at all. I don't think if you could just get Israelis and Palestinians together in the same room, I think what would happen is they'd kill each other.
No, I didn't really mean.
But you can see there are much bigger squish heads than me.
Oh yes.
And much bigger squish head one-worlders than me.
No, you're a sort of a Niebuhrian optimist, I would say.
Well, I'm not by nature optimistic. I just don't see any alternative to I don't know. I just don't see any alternative to trying. And
I'm not saying we shouldn't try, Bob. I mean, I wouldn't write this book if I didn't think, for example, that it's worth trying to insist within religion on accentuating the more tolerant, open, and mysterious understanding of it, because I think it's critical to world peace. I mean, that's what I'm arguing for. I'm arguing for it with more credibility as a Christian within my own tradition, because that's where I start from. But yeah, no, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just being a little depressed about the possibility of our getting to that stage of advancement in time. Because the pace of human technological advance is so greater than the pace of human evolutionary advance.
Hey, you're telling me, man.
I mean, that's my fear. That's the great fear that hangs over all of us. And it may be the way human beings are that it will take catastrophe for us to get to where we are.
That's my fear. That's my fear.
It may be an optimistic, because the alternative, human beings don't. I mean, look. We can't even bloody sort out Social Security, okay? We can't even get to a point where grown-ups in Washington can decide the obvious things we have to do to make it solvent, let alone Medicare. So if we can't do that without a crisis, what makes you think we're going to resolve religious difference without a crisis?
Well, at the moment, a key ingredient in that hope is that I can hear my daughter, she's practicing piano and playing this, you would know the song, it's a classic, and it's so uplifting.
What is it?
I'm not going to try to hum it.
Just tell me it's not John Lennon's Imagine, okay?
No, it's true. Right. It's true classical music. It's you would consider it cliched, I'm sure. Anybody who knows classical music, it's so often played. But anyway, fills me with hope.
My hope comes entirely from the notion that at some point our lives are redeemable. But I think that the hope comes from just our interpersonal relations and our ability to prevent the worst cruelty. I don't have much greater hope than that. But that's the conservative in me.
That is the conservative in you, and it's a conservative in this book. And I'll hold it up one more time, as if I haven't been charitable enough toward it.
Well, thank you.
No, but I really did enjoy it, and I wasn't actually, honestly, planning to.
Well, the best experience of this has been, and you probably heard this from your own books, is that sometimes, a book is launched and it takes time for readers to actually get over their objection to reading it, and then it has a second life. And I think, people still, I'm sucking up to you now, but people still read The Moral Animal. I personally think that Nonzero was one of the most exciting books intellectually I've read, and exciting because of the places I disagreed with it as much as the places I agreed with it. But sometimes books take time, and sometimes they take actually reading. And the book industry now is not interested in the experience of putting ideas out there to take time to absorb and to debate. They're interested in the 4-week window of promotion, and then they forget about it.
No, it's harder and harder, and this concerns me greatly. But this has been great, and I want to say that I think, we've kind of left the world in suspense here as to whether there is any hope, since we disagree.
There's no hope.
No, so I do think you're going to have to come back at some point, and we're going to have to resume this conversation. Because for one thing, we agree. We've been acting as if we both know what needs to be kind of done on the moral/spiritual front, but actually we would have disagreements about in the way in which, say the worldview of Americans needs to change and so on. So there's disagreement within these lines, I think. But in any event, I just don't think we can leave our vast viewing audience feeling so ambivalent, and so at some point you're going to have to come back.
I'd be delighted to, Bob. Daisy. I do think that, and I think what America means also is worth debating, and what it can mean, and what we've lost in the last 4 years. When I go home to England and when I go to Europe, I've been used to anti-Americanism. I grew up with it. I was the schmuck at Oxford who was defending America all the time. I had a champagne party to welcome the cruise missiles that arrived in 1983. I have never experienced the unanimity of hostility, not just to the United States, but to the American people.
Yeah.
Europeans will forgive Americans electing him in 2000. They will never forgive them for re-electing him in 2000.
And with some justice, because by then we knew.
By then we knew. You and I at least can say we knew, and we did what we did. But the rest of the world just thinks they really do. I think I've sensed a real shift, and that is a huge loss of American power.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. I think a grassroots opinion of Americans has more to do with America's national security than ever before, and it is at roughly a low ebb. Bad combination.
Yep.
So we'll solve all those problems next time.
Okay, Bob. Thanks a lot for this.